Hello there, long time no see, yet another new job, yet another city move, so my apologies for not uploading sooner. Hope you're all well and avoiding either freezing or penury from heating bills. Quick shout, if you like the channel or my rather ridiculous voice, please support the channel by sharing and subscribing. I wasn't planning on making this video. I'm actually knee deep in a video about the NHS and whether it's sustainable, and what needs to happen in order to make it so, which is very pertinent because the NHS feels like it's on the brink of collapse. Instead, the Tories issued a Section 35 order on the Scottish Government's Gender Recognition Reform Bill and are trying to defend their position on the bill. Despite what you think about trans rights reform and what your position is on the GRR bill, I obviously support both. I've instead been drawn into loads of utterly ridiculous arguments on the nature of Scotland in the Union and how the United Kingdom functions. I'm not going to put them on a blast because I don't think that's fair, but one such conversation ridiculously tried to claim England was overruling Scotland and speaking in the language of colonialism, which is frankly absurd and insulting. So what I'm going to do in this handy little video is explain how the United Kingdom is set up. I'm going to apologise now because I suspect more than a few people will object or complain. This video is not about the rightness of the setup, just what it is. So let's do some history first. After the Romans left Britain, Angles, Saxons and Jutes migrated over in huge numbers in what would become England and pushed out or assimilated the native Britons and remaining Romans into the coalescing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that jostled for prominence and power over the other. With the arrival of the Norsemen and them going a Vikinger, most of those kingdoms collapsed or were taken over by the Norse. Eventually, this formed a Kingdom of England, which was then taken by the Norman William the Conqueror. Whilst all this was going on, in Scotland, the Picts formed a confederation which eventually resulted in the Kingdom of Alba and eventually Scotland, which was also suffering from Viking raids. There was a constant jostling with the northern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and eventually England for more territory over the centuries. What would form the Principality of Wales was also a disparate collection of remaining Briton tribes from the Roman era and then pushed further by the arriving Saxons, which is why King Arthur was probably what we'd call Welsh, and then invaded and conquered by Edward I. The medieval kingdoms of England and Scotland warred over the centuries, from small border skirmishes to outright wars of conquest. This all changed during the end of the Tudor period and the beginning of the Stuart period. The United Kingdom of Great Britain was founded in 1707, amended in 1800 when Ireland was annexed into the Union as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and then with Irish independence amended again to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Prior to these treaties, England and Scotland existed as personal unions, which in feudal parlance are two separate kingdom titles owned by the same person or family. Players of Europa Universalis will obviously be familiar to the significance. The important point is that whilst the kingdoms share a monarch, they are still separate states, remaining separate entities with different cultures, often finances and so on. Whilst varying levels of integration exist and existed, they are not the same state and often governed by two separate governments. So when James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne following the death of Elizabeth I to become James I of England, the kingdoms of England and Scotland were united under one throne, but with two separate states. With the end of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which is a lovely name, there was a push over fear of French involvement in Ireland to properly, legally bring Ireland into the Union, and that led to the Act of Union of 1800. What the two Acts of Union together did was dissolve the Kingdom of England, dissolve the Kingdom of Scotland, and dissolve the Kingdom of Ireland, and form the Kingdom of Great Britain, and then the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. That's a very long way of saying that legally, the country of England, Scotland and Ireland ceased to exist and were replaced by a single, unitary state called the UK, with the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922 and Irish independence in 1927. This changed again, with the UK losing Ireland and changing that to just Northern Ireland, as the majority of Northern Irish voters exercise their legal right to remain part of the United Kingdom and not join the Irish Republic, but that is part of a very complicated conversation that I am not going to get involved in here. Wales is the outlier. With the annexation of Wales following Edward I's conquest, the Wales laws between 1535 and 1542 dissolved the Principality of Wales beyond a ceremonial title for the heir apparent of the English and then British throne. From then on until 1948, when one talked of England, one also talked of Wales. The central principle of the United Kingdom, which has evolved over time, is that there is one legitimate sovereign voice of all the peoples in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and that is the Parliament that sits at the Palace of Westminster, and that represents all the nations and peoples. There is no other sovereign voice. That Parliament is not an English one, it is a UK one, and that is a huge difference. Whilst the majority of the population does live in England, it is not English. There is a difference between tyranny of the majority and disenfranchisement altogether. The Union functions along the one person, one vote system, which enfranchises all of the people of the United Kingdom regardless of which of the constituent nations they live in. Each area is broken down into a constituency which is determined roughly by population density, ensuring at all times that constituencies are representative of the majority of the people on the Isles. Over time, as England has become more dense, so too has the concentration of constituencies towards it. But this is the consequence of population density rather than a more sinister move of disenfranchisement. And that is why in Westminster all the constituencies are represented and not just English ones or from another area. In the way the country functions, it is a multinational union, and I mean that in the understanding of a nation, not a country. So broadly, you have many nations present in the United Kingdom, but the four biggest are Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish and English. This is quite common for most modern countries, which are de facto unions of many peoples within the same broad cultural group. Germany, for example, is the union of many, many smaller, quite distinct states that used to form the HRE and were unified in the late 1800s by the Prussians. The Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain, almost every country in the world is a union of many nations. How they choose to reflect these nations depends entirely on the constitutional setup of that country. The UK used to not recognise any difference beyond the two legal systems in England and Scotland, and had strong central rule similar to France prior to their push towards a limited form of regionalisation. But following a constitutional convention and then a referendum, Labour in 1997 oversaw the creation of the Scotland Act and then the Scottish Parliament and the then named Scottish Executive in 1999. Crucially, this is not a sovereign parliament of a country. Legally, it is covered under a doctrine of delegated sovereignty, which is where a sovereign entity allows a non-sovereign entity to act on its behalf whilst retaining ultimate sovereign authority. What this means is that Westminster is still the only sovereign voice of all of the peoples in the United Kingdom, including the people of Scotland, and retains that authority and legitimacy through its elections, but has created an institution that allows for better governance by delegating that sovereignty to the Scottish Parliament. The Scotland Act and the Wales Act, which oversaw the creation of devolved legislatures, clearly delineated the bounds in which the devolved administrations are capable of legislating, where and how they can diverge from the UK Parliament and where they cannot. Crucially, they are not allowed to act on matters which either impact the entirety of the United Kingdom or on matters which are reserved, such as the Constitution. The Constitution is one that is quite relevant recently because the United Kingdom government refused to give consent to another Section 30 order which allows for a referendum on Scottish independence. This was portrayed by some as a denial of democracy, and there were many calls for that power to be transferred to the Scottish Parliament. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, not a single democracy on the planet allows unilateral exercise of secession powers. After all, most countries do not like to see their territories broken up, and balkanisation is generally considered not to be a good thing. Also touching on this point very briefly, Democracy is not the unbound rule of the mob. I cannot, for example, tomorrow gather the majority of voters in Yorkshire and declare the independent Socialist Republic of Yorkshire, for example. Democracy has rules and conventions, and that is part of what is governing the refusal of the UK government on another Scottish independence referendum. Moving on to a perhaps controversial and poorly understood aspect of the Houses of Parliament, the House of Lords. The House of Lords is a relic of Britain's past as a feudal nation that did not see a proper revolution or overthrow aside from the brief interlude of Cromwell. It is a transition of feudal lords into the more administrative state that grew with the differing political theories in the 1700s and onwards with the People's Budget, Lloyd George and the Salisbury Convention. The primacy of the Commons was well and truly established. The House of Lords can no longer, conventionally, permanently block anything the House of Commons issues. It is merely an advisory, almost technocratic house in nature. It allows for elevated lords, who are primarily life peers, to comment on various pieces of legislation without fear or favour or having to pander towards an electorate, which is an important tool in a democracy. It acts as a stopgap to push back and make sure that the Commons does not legislate in a rush, overtaken by short-term popular will. A good example of this is when the Lords stripped many of the provisions from the Johnson government's Borders Bill, arguing they're in breach of our obligations towards human rights. This despite the build-up of xenophobic rhetoric towards people arriving apparently illegally in the United Kingdom. At no point will any part of the House of Commons ever be able to say they were not warned about the consequences of a popular bill being pushed through over technical or legal objections, and that stems from a combination of the House of Lords and the civil service. Theories of democracy aside, House of Lords reform is a hot topic in the United Kingdom political bubble, where people like me argue about this constantly. Some would prefer an elected upper chamber, potentially by proportional representation, to counterbalance the first past the post elected Commons. Others would like to see a Senate of Nations, similar in vein to the US Senate, others the German Bundesrat, and so on. These conversations go on and are part of the ongoing, flexible nature of the British Constitution. I'll quickly cover the monarchy. The monarchy is possibly the least understood part of the UK. The monarch has simultaneously all the power and none of the power. In perhaps the most convoluted way, and possibly the most British way, we have tacitly accepted that the position of dictator, as the Romans would put it, is a necessary stopgap in any democratic system, but you cannot trust anyone to truly exercise those powers. They need to rest somewhere, but where? Over time, the answer for Britain was we will put them with a monarch who can theoretically exercise that power, but is very aware that exercise of those powers without consent from the people is a capital offence. Essentially, the British theory of governance is that the people are safer with an unelected figurehead knowing they are unelected and therefore illegitimate, instead of risking a directly elected head of state, of which the temptation to stay is only truly checked by the strength of institutions and individuals in their way. And now on to the House of Commons. This is a peculiar institution, frequently referred to as the Mother of Parliaments, though it technically isn't the oldest in the world. We elect 650 members of Parliament to speak on our behalf on issues large and small. The party that has a majority of MPs has for the past 400 odd years chosen a leader known as the Prime Minister. We do not, and never have, directly elected the Prime Minister. Every single Prime Minister is an unelected Prime Minister. They are an ordinary MP that holds the seal of the First Lord of the Treasury and the Minister of the Civil Service. They are only Prime Minister so long as they can command the confidence of the House of Commons, and therefore their position is always insecure. There are no term limits, there are no mandated periods of office. Tomorrow, the Conservative Party could easily decide they no longer want Rishi Sunak to be the Prime Minister and choose to elect another, and they could do the same every week until the next election, which must be no later than 2025. The mandate of an election rests with the party, not the politician. This is another safeguard against dictatorship because no one individual can ever say they speak for the nation. When combined with the monarchy, populists have often struggled in Britain because there often isn't the space or mechanism by which they can carry their populist agenda into the corridors of power. Because no parliament can ever fully bind a future parliament, therefore nothing that is done cannot be undone. Parliament is governed by convention. You know the funny joke about tradition being peer pressure from dead people? Ramp that up by about 1,000 and that is what convention is to Parliament. Everything is governed by convention, and that convention stays until there is a very, very big need to remove it. For example, it used to be convention that the House of Lords was a legislative house of equal weight to the Commons. Then that changed, and the new convention, I say new but it's a century old, is that the House of Lords is not equal to the House of Commons. The flexibility is one of the British state's greatest strengths in that it allows for a far more flexible legislative chamber, even if that means that Brits have to be far more vigilant about their individual and collective rights. Britain does retain many overseas territories and crown dependencies, but those are a complicated legal topic that isn't really relevant, so beyond mentioning they exist, there really isn't much to say there. In a broader sense, many of the issues which currently affect Britain stem from the fact that politics in Britain has become significantly more personal in the past few decades in a system that is designed to refrain from the more personal nature of politics, but that is a conversation for a different time. There is a larger conversation to be had, perhaps about the important semantic difference of what makes a country and what makes a nation. Generally, state and country are used interchangeably, and nation tends to be the collection of people with a shared identity who often reside in a country, but not exclusively in one. It's a thorny, complex, nuanced and controversial conversation, of course. So to conclude, I'd just like to say this. None of this is a moral judgment or ascribing a moral value to any of the institutions in Britain, or to say that any reform is the right one. That is something to talk about at a different time in a different sense. To talk about the rightness of something often requires knowledge and understanding of the issue, and that is something I hope this episode has provided. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, share and subscribe. Those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments section or in the Discord. Lastly, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who has supported me these past few months, because it's been a difficult time. You know who you are and you're all wonderful.